Last time, a decade of civil wars had accelerated the fracturing of the Seleucid Empire. But by 120 BC, Antiochus VIII Grypus had emerged as the sole ruler of what remained of the kingdom. Once again, the empire was blessed with a few precious years of peace, but this was to be fleeting. It is true that the exhausted kingdom needed a break from war, but inactivity also meant accepting that the various cities and regions which had de facto asserted their independence over the previous decade were not going to be brought back into the imperial fold anytime soon. Whether this was a hard but necessary decision, or rather was indicative of a slothful ruler, is a matter of debate. Certainly though, the king lived a wasteful and indulgent life, hosting vast feasts at the paradise of Daphne, where the remaining treasure of the realm was trivially frittered away, with gold wreaths and silver plates being given to the various attendees. Athenaeus, writing in the 3rd century AD, says that by now the people of Syria had become degenerate, spending their days gratifying their gluttonous stomachs, drowning themselves with wine, and listening to the loud music of the lyre. Grypus himself enjoyed writing poems on the topic of poison, a popular theme of the day, an example of which survives in the writings of Galen. Perhaps he had become interested in this topic because his mother, Cleopatra, had attempted to serve him a chalice of poisoned wine. For the time being in Syria, there was peace. However, there still remained many threats to the Seleucids. The Romans in the west, the Ptolemies in the south, and the Parthians in the east, whose new king, Mithridates II, had recently been campaigning in Armenia. Most of all, in the city of Cyzicus, on the coast of the Propontis, there lived another Antiochus, this one being a half-brother and cousin of Antiochus Grypus, with the two men sharing a mother and their fathers having both been kings in Syria. This other Antiochus was the sole person who was in a position to make a legitimate case for the Seleucid throne. A claim, if pressed, would drive the realm into yet another civil war. Unlike the other threats to the kingdom, this one was but only a single man, and if he could be extinguished, then his claim would die with him. This being the case, it is little wonder that Grypus made an attempt to poison his brother. We do not know the details of this plot, but the scheme was uncovered and foiled. Antiochus Cyzicenus now knew that Grypus would not leave him alone to live out his life unmolested, and so began preparations to invade Syria. In an attempt to secure peace, the Seleucid monarch had now inadvertently summoned war into his kingdom. In 116 BC, Ptolemy VIII Physcon had died, after having been variously on and off the Egyptian throne for over half a century, making him one of the longest-lasting Hellenistic kings. Most likely in the same year, his eldest wife and former rival for power, Cleopatra II, had also died. This left his younger wife, Cleopatra III, as the main power in the Ptolemaic court, with her dead husband's will leaving to her the authority to elect his successor from among his sons. The queen desired to appoint her second son, Ptolemy Alexander, as the new king, both because the younger man would be more easily controlled, and because Cleopatra disliked her eldest son, Ptolemy Soter Lathyrus. However, the people of Alexandria were firmly in the camp of the firstborn, as was tradition, and fearing rebellion, the queen acceded to their demands, and so Ptolemy Lathyrus became the 9th of his name to be crowned pharaoh. By this time, the new king had already been wed to his eldest sister Cleopatra IV, and the couple had possibly produced 2 children. Yet Cleopatra III compelled her son to divorce this sister, whom he loved, and instead marry Cleopatra Selene, one of his younger sisters. Her reasons for wanting this are unclear, but the king obeyed, and in so doing, Cleopatra IV became an enemy of her mother. The spurned queen fled to Cyprus, where her other brother, Ptolemy Alexander, had been appointed as strategos over the island, himself in a quasi-exile. In 114 or 113 BC, Antiochus Cyzicenus launched his campaign against his half-brother, invading Cilicia and Syria. In this endeavour he experienced some initial success, with Antioch itself falling to his forces by 113 BC. Seeing a chance for power and for eventual revenge, Cleopatra IV sailed from Cyprus to Syria. There she married Cyzicenus and joined what forces and wealth she had to his own. One should remember that the wife of Antiochus Grypus was Cleopatra Tryphaenaea, another daughter of Cleopatra III, so now this Seleucid civil war had also become, in a sense, a Ptolemaic civil war. Brother against brother, sister against sister. The Ptolemaic court had its partisan in the form of Grypus, while Ptolemy Alexander provided support for Cyzicenus. Despite the sweeping advance of Cyzicenus through the Syrian heartlands, Grypus managed to stabilise his position, and then even to counterattack. It is likely he was receiving not insubstantial aid directly from Egypt in order to accomplish this. In 112 BC, the two sides met in a major battle, which resulted in a shocking decisive defeat for Cyzicenus, with the usurper being put to flight. Grypus followed this up with a lightning assault on Antioch, which occurred so quickly that Cleopatra IV was unable to escape in time. Tryphaenaea was on the warpath, thirsting to wreak a vengeance upon her sister for invading her husband's kingdom and marrying his enemy. Grypus himself was taken aback by this ferocity and pleaded with his wife to not act in such a heinous and impious way, arguing that it was not in the Macedonian tradition to subject women to the perils of war, nor did he reason that murdering his sister-in-law would improve his military situation. These arguments did not at all sway Tryphaenaea, but further enraged her, as she mistook her husband's pious concerns for a seed of adulterous affection. She personally took charge of a group of soldiers and marched on the temple in which Cleopatra IV had taken refuge. There they found the queen clutching herself to the cult statue of Artemis, begging the goddess for her intercession. In order to drag her away from the idol, the soldiers cut off her arms. As she lay dying, Cleopatra IV called down curses upon her murderers, imploring the Furies to wreak a vengeance upon them. Not long after, Cyzicenus rallied his forces and launched a counterattack, retaking Antioch by 110 BC, this time instead forcing Grypus to beat a hasty retreat. In an appropriate twist of fate, now Cleopatra Tryphaenaea fell into the hands of her brother-in-law, who subsequently put her to death as punishment for her act of sororicide. It seems that the Furies indeed did heed the lamentations of Cleopatra IV. With the wives of both brothers now having been killed in the conflict, one can only imagine how bitter the enmity between these men was. Yet another counterattack on Antioch soon occurred, with the city falling back into the possession of Grypus in the following year. The beleaguered capital had now changed hands 4 times. Following these rapid swings of fortune, the civil war shifted into a phase of prolonged stalemate, with neither side making any significant gains. Josephus describes the two combatants as being like athletes whose strength was exhausted, but who were both too obstinate to yield, so instead they would fight only intermittently, with breaks to rest in between. During this period, Grypus went to Aspendus in Pamphylia in an effort to recruit more mercenary forces in order to continue the fight. While he was gone, there were no major changes in the front line of the conflict. Rather than focusing on the matters of war, Cyzicenus was taken up with various hobbies. He drank a good deal, as many of his ancestors had, and would often sneak out of his palace under cover of night in order to go hunting, coming close to death at the hands of boars, leopards, and lions on a number of occasions. More curiously, he was fascinated by mimes and mummers, and would personally engage in performances of puppetry, as well as commission large moving gilt models of various animals. While Grypus was abroad and Cyzicenus was preoccupied in his playhouse, the state of the rest of the Seleucid realm continued to degrade. Early in the conflict, around 113 BC, the city of Europos, the Macedonian colony founded by Seleucus Nicator on the west bank of the Euphrates, fell to Mithridates II, giving the Parthians their first foothold in Syria proper. The two Antiochi were too distracted with each other to pay this existential threat any heed, and so no counterattack came. For the time being, the Parthians were content to sit at the edge of the kingdom, and observed from afar as it tore itself apart. Other parts of the empire broke away at around the same time, as had cities such as Tyre and Aradus during the previous civil war. The city of Sidon, formerly under the control of Grypus, ceased minting Seleucid coinage around 111 BC. In 109 BC, a letter from Antiochus Grypus to Ptolemy Alexander mentions the city of Seleucia Pieria, the very place where Seleucus Nicator was buried, and the former main base of the Seleucid navy, and how he had granted it full liberty in exchange for their support for him. It is worth noting that at some point during the conflict, the factions favoured by the two Ptolemaic princes seemed to have switched, with Grypus now in communication with Ptolemy Alexander, while Cyzicenus garnered the support of Ptolemy Lathyrus. This change in policy perhaps comes as a result of Lathyrus growing more confident in his reign and breaking away from the influence of his mother. The loss of both Ptolemaic queens would have also invalidated any existing alliances. In 108 BC, High Priest John Hyrcanus again decided to try his luck and carve further territory out of the Seleucid Empire. He marched against the great city of Samaria, which, while once the capital of the ancient kingdom of Israel, had been destroyed and refounded in the days of Alexander the Great as a Greek military colony. The city was invested by Hyrcanus and two of his sons, Aristobulus and Antigonus, with their forces encircling the walls with their own circumvallations. Famine thus set in, but the citizens managed to send a message to Cyzicenus, seeking his aid. The Seleucid king responded, marching to break the siege, but his army was repulsed, and he fled back to Scythopolis. Cyzicenus then in turn requested aid from Ptolemy Lathyrus, who acceded and quickly dispatched 6,000 men to Colle, Syria, against the wishes of Cleopatra III. As many Seleucid generals had done in the past, rather than engage in direct battle, Cyzicenus instead used his men like brigands, plundering and ravaging Judea, seeking to draw the Maccabean forces away from Samaria so it could be resupplied. This proved unsuccessful and attritional losses were high. Eventually the king grew frustrated and left, returning to Tripolis, appointing two commanders, Calamandrus and Epicrates, to continue his campaign. Not long after, the impetuous Calamandrus launched a very reckless attack upon the Maccabees, and paid for this with his life. Epicrates, on the other hand, accepted a handsome bribe in exchange for handing over Scythopolis to the Jews. Following a year of siege, Samaria finally fell to Hyrcanus. Enraged by its obstinacy, and because the people of the city had supported campaigns against Judea in the past, the high priest had the city destroyed entirely. First levelling the buildings, and then having channels dug so that the rains coming down the mountain would gradually flood the site, in order that no trace of the place should remain. Given the limited strength of his army, and given his ongoing war with Antiochus Grypus, no counterattack came from Cyzicenus. In Alexandria, the decision of Ptolemy Lathyrus to ally with Cyzicenus had been the final straw for Cleopatra III, and she enacted a plan against him. She took some trusted eunuchs from within the palace, inflicted wounds upon them, and then took them before the people of the city, claiming that both she and they had been the victims of Ptolemy Lathyrus, painting him as an abuser. A lynch mob quickly formed, which forced the pharaoh to flee by sea. At the same time, Ptolemy Alexander, Cleopatra's original preference to rule, was brought back to Egypt from Cyprus and crowned as king. At some early point during this period of exile, Lathyrus was hiding in Seleucia, given it was now a free city, but a plot came against him from one of his own inner circle. The scheme was foiled and the traitor was punished, but after that, the former pharaoh became highly paranoid. Shortly after this, Lathyrus set sail for Cyprus and established himself as lord over what had formerly been his younger brother's domain. In 104 BC, High Priest John Hyrcanus died peacefully. He was succeeded by his eldest son, Aristobulus, who, rather than accept merely the position of high priest, also had himself crowned as king of Judea, establishing the Hasmonean dynasty, and becoming the first Jewish monarch since before the Babylonian captivity, 481 years and 3 months earlier, according to Josephus. We need not concern ourselves with the specific details of Aristobulus's reign, only that during it he made war on the Etrurians, annexing part of the area around Galilee into his kingdom. They themselves had taken advantage of the recent Seleucid crises to establish a de facto state of independence, but now were swallowed up by a larger power. After only a year on the throne, Aristobulus dropped dead, reportedly due to a sickness brought on by the guilt he felt for having killed his brother, Antigonus. He was succeeded by his younger brother, Alexander Jannaeus. In 103 BC, this second Hasmonean king elected to continue the policy of expansion, now targeting the coastal cities of Palestine. Much of the region fell quickly, but the cities of Ptolemais and Gaza held out. The people of these cities appealed to both Antiochus Grypus and Antiochus Cyzicenus, but the two kings were too distracted by each other to come to the aid of their own citizens. In a state of desperation, envoys were sent to Cyprus, requesting the protection of Ptolemy Lathyrus. Upon hearing of their plight, he quickly gathered an army and set sail for the Levant. During the interval, a local politician in Ptolemais, Deipnosophists, convinced the people that it would be better for them to fight the Jewish forces alone, rather than to allow Lathyrus to have rulership over them, as his presence would antagonize Cleopatra in Egypt to go to war against them, who they would not be able to defeat. So, upon the landing of a 30,000 strong Cypriot force at Sycamina, Ptolemaeus would not admit the envoys of Lathyrus, much to the confusion of the king. The Gazaeans, led by a man named Julius, had not experienced the same change of heart, and requested that this new army come to their aid. Fearing the might of Lathyrus's army, Alexander Jannaeus withdrew back to Judea. The Jewish king then made diplomatic overtures to Ptolemy in order to forestall any advance into Judea proper. While sworn agreements of alliance were made between the two men, secretly, Jannaeus had been corresponding with Cleopatra III in Egypt, requesting that she intervene in order to expel her eldest son, knowing well the vast hatred for him which she harboured in her heart. This treachery was revealed to Lathyrus, who, enraged, broke his agreements and began a campaign against Judea. Firstly, he besieged Ptolemais, as the city and its port would be a highly valuable base of operations. With this siege established, then Lathyrus took the bulk of his forces and invaded the Hasmonean kingdom, striking first at Antiochus in Galilee, capturing the city and with it 10,000 prisoners, alongside a great deal of treasure. A follow-up attack was made on the nearby town of Sepphoris, but the Cypriot forces were repulsed. Thereafter, the armies of the two kings met in battle near a place called Asiphon, in the Jordan Valley south of Galilee. The army of Lathyrus was encamped across the Jordan from the Jewish position. Despite being outnumbered, Philostephanus, the captain of the army, decided to force a battle and elected to march his troops across the river and face the Jews outside their camp. Jannaeus did nothing to oppose this, believing that this would only mean that the Cypriots had nowhere to retreat to, which would give him the opportunity for a total victory. Of course, this is a two-edged sword, for, having nowhere to retreat to, the men of Lathyrus would be motivated to fight all the harder. The battle was joined, and it was a bloody affair. When it looked like one of his flanks was giving ground, Philostephanus gathered a body of men and charged to the relief of his wing. Meanwhile, the Cypriots managed to break the opposite flank of the Jewish army, putting them to flight, with no reinforcements coming to rescue them. At the sight of their fleeing comrades, the Hasmonean soldiers lost heart, and quickly the battle turned into a general rout, with Philostephanus pursuing, cutting down tens of thousands of men in the process. With the Jewish forces in a state of utter disarray, Lathyrus soon overran Judea. According to Josephus, women and infants were chopped up, boiled in cauldrons, and then eaten, so as to make his men appear truly terrifying to the enemy. But this is most likely hyperbole. In the meantime, Ptolemaeus also fell to the forces of Lathyrus. By this point, Cleopatra could no longer bring herself to simply watch, but resolved to intervene in full force against her son. Ptolemy Alexander was dispatched by sea to attack Phoenicia, while Cleopatra marched an army overland into the Levant, alongside two Egyptian Jewish generals, Chalchias and Ananias, who were the sons of Onias IV, who we have earlier mentioned as having established a rival temple at Leontopolis during the reign of Ptolemy VI Philometor. The queen besieged Ptolemaeus, but Lathyrus did not wish to risk a pitched battle against her forces, and so did not come to its relief. Instead, he saw an opportunity to counterattack into Egypt and retake Alexandria. Word of this attempt made its way to Cleopatra, who sent a portion of her force back home, where they successfully foiled the invasion. What remained of Lathyrus' army retreated back to Gaza, where they wintered. Ptolemaeus fell to the Egyptian forces shortly thereafter. Some of Cleopatra's advisors urged her to now conquer Judea, in order to at last reincorporate the region back into the Ptolemaic kingdom, a region which had been taken from them by Antiochus the Great a century earlier. However, Ananias pleaded with the queen on behalf of his kinsman, claiming that it would be an injustice to make war on a co-belligerent, and that it would turn all Jews everywhere against Egypt. Cleopatra heeded this advice, and soon after concluded a formal alliance with Alexander Jannaeus at Scythopolis. With his flank protected, the Hasmonean king returned to his earlier policy of expansion, besieging and seizing Gadara, yet another Seleucid city. Once again, no response came from either of the warring Seleucid brothers. Following this, Jannaeus marched across the Jordan and seized Amathus, which was a possession of Diodorus, son of Zeno, the tyrant of Rhabdomana. Following this sacking, Diodorus suddenly appeared with a small force, captured the Jewish baggage train, and put some 10,000 Jews to the sword. This bloody nose was sufficient to force Jannaeus to withdraw back across the Jordan. He then resolved to change tack, and by about 102 BC he had marched to the Mediterranean coast. Ptolemy Lathyrus had by now retreated to Cyprus, so the Hasmoneans helped themselves to Raphia and Anthedon, before then laying siege to Gaza. The Gazaeans made a valiant resistance, holding the line for a year and inflicting heavy losses on the attacking army. Eventually the city surrendered, but Jannaeus, in an act of spite, unleashed his men upon the population, who were slaughtered. The 500 councillors of the city took refuge in the temple of Apollo, but having no respect for the pagan holy places of the Gentiles, the Jewish soldiers put them all to the sword. Gaza was razed, and thereafter the king returned to Jerusalem. To put yet another nail in the coffin of Seleucid dominion over the territories to the south of Syria, a new power had arisen there. The Arab Nabateans had long existed as nomads in the deserts and arid lands in the south of the Transjordan and in Arabia. They gradually became more sedentary and began to coalesce into an increasingly organised polity during the time of Antiochus IV. Broadly, they remained peaceful, trading with both the Seleucids and the Hasmoneans, although with the latter, tensions had begun to arise following the various incursions over the Jordan and the sacking of Gaza, a major export port for goods travelling through Nabatean lands. While for now they were providing no immediate threat to the Seleucids, the vacuum of authority in the south had allowed the creation of yet another player in the game who would now have to be contended with. On the subject of newer players in the game, at about this time Antiochus Grypus married off one of his daughters, Laodice, to Mithridates Callinicus, the king of Commagene. The de facto independence of Commagene had been tolerated for generations at this point, but now one of the Seleucid kings evidently found it necessary to treat the state as an equal and to form an alliance, perhaps fearing that she could join the civil war on the side of Antiochus Cyzicenus, or perhaps seeking to prevent the expansion of Roman influence there, which had been steadily growing eastward. In fact, in 102 BC, the praetor Marcus Antonius, whose grandson would more famously bear that name, sailed with a fleet to Cilicia, then still a Seleucid territory, and campaigned against pirate bases there, which had become prominent during the first reign of Demetrius II Nicator, some 40 years earlier. As far as we are aware, this was done without invitation or approval, which again speaks to the present impotence of the Seleucid state and the lack of respect which they were being shown by the other powers of the Mediterranean. At about this time, Cleopatra III dispatched her daughter, Cleopatra Selene, formerly the wife of Ptolemy Lathyrus, to Syria, where she was to wed Antiochus Grypus, so as to re-establish the earlier alliance which had existed between the two factions prior to its severance upon the death of Cleopatra Tryphaena. However, this alliance was once again broken in late 101 BC when Cleopatra III died, possibly murdered by her son, Ptolemy Alexander, as many ancient writers allege. With her death, the Ptolemaic effort to reincorporate Colle Syria also died, as the obese and decadent pharaoh was uninterested in campaigning. Throughout this time, the Seleucid civil war was still ongoing, yet no significant changes in territory had occurred. In 96 BC, after the war had now been ongoing for about 18 years, a certain general of Grypus, Heraclian of Berea, betrayed his benefactor and assassinated the Seleucid king. Antiochus VIII Grypus was about 45 years old and had reigned for 29 of those. If it had been his intention to seize control of the state for himself, Heraclian totally failed in this endeavour. However, it seems that he did manage to quite happily rule over his East Syrian home of Berea and some of the towns adjacent to it as a warlord, eventually passing his position as tyrant onto his son, Straton. In the chaos following the assassination, Antiochus Cyzicenus was finally able to organise an offensive campaign and once again retook Antioch. However, the eldest son of Grypus, Seleucus VI Epiphanes Nicanor, raised a new army and took to the field against his uncle. In 95 BC, their forces met in battle, and the result was a decisive victory for the young king. According to Eusebius, Antiochus IX Cyzicenus took his own life in the aftermath, rather than be captured, while Josephus tells us that he was actually captured and subsequently executed. Suddenly, both of the Antiochi brothers lay dead, with both having utterly failed to meaningfully defeat the other and reunite Syria. What is there that we can say about the two Antiochi? Certainly, nothing good. It is hard to believe these men were members of the dynasty which had produced such characters of renown as Seleucus Nicator, Antiochus the Great, and Antiochus Epiphanes. There is little to be seen of what made those men great in the natures of either Grypus or Cyzicenus. Of their foibles, perhaps that is where their familial inheritance shone through. They were both lovers of the drink and of excess more generally, and they both were slothful and decadent in the manner of the worst of their bloodline. These men were wastrels, and the manner in which they frittered away the remains of a once great empire was naught but a farce. Another 20 years of war had left Syria depleted in terms of treasure and of manpower, with the effective area controlled by the Seleucids being reduced to merely parts of Syria and Cilicia. Next time, Syria immediately falls into yet another mess of dynastic civil wars, which culminate in the ultimate conquest of the once mighty Seleucid Empire. If you have any comments, criticism, or questions, please post them below, and thank you for listening.